Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you former White House Press Secretary and Communications Director Sean Spicer. Sean Spicer is a lifelong Republican. His role in reshaping the Republican National Committee's PR strategy helped the party rebuild after losses in 2012. He implemented his same strategies in 2014 and led the party to sweeping victories. In 2016, prior to the must-see Republican primary debates, Sean worked on behalf of the party to restructure debate formats, creating more informative and fair debates. Sean's efforts as the RNC's chief strategist and communications director landed him a spot in PR Week's Power 15 list for 2016. He last joined us at the Reagan Library in July of 2018 for his book The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President. He's here with us today to have a virtual discussion about his brand new book, Leading America, which examines the upwards battle conservatives have to face from the media, Hollywood, academia, and big tech. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program coming to you from our Air Force One Pavilion Leadership Academy Oval Office with Sean Spicer and Reagan Foundation and Institute Executive Director John Heybusch.
Sean Spicer, it is great to have you with us at the Reagan Library, all obviously socially distanced and a long way away, but congratulations, really great book. I had a lot of fun reading this, so I know it's your second book, but congrats on a really great read.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you again. It's a shame not to be back at such a historic place and to you doing this like I did. And when I did my first book tour, it was actually just so refreshing to come out there and have a discussion with you and answer questions. And so it's great that we get to do this, but it's a shame it can't be in person.
Yeah, well, when the world opens back up out here again, Sean, we'd love to have you, so put it on your calendar. Now, this is your second book. You've been as busy as it gets since you left the White House, and when you wrote this book, just as I expected, you took the opportunity near your first chapter to tell your story about Dancing with the Stars and why you did it and the whole decision process that led to that. And I wonder if you'd talk to us about your experience. Would you do it again? Do you feel like it was good for your career? And just kind of get into that for us.
Yeah, I mean, so as I mentioned in the book, I was asked right when I left the White House. I said no for a lot of reasons that I go into, most of which are because I'm a horrible dancer and I have no rhythm. And there was a huge time commitment that I just didn't have. And so the long story short is that I continued the conversation with the executives there. I walked through the whole process in the book. And I finally came to a point where I said to myself, like, you don't get that many opportunities to do things that are kind of fun and different. And at some point, people just stop asking and they don't go, So I thought, okay, this is the last time. And I developed a sort of a friendship and a bond with some of the executives there who had been very helpful since that first interaction with other opportunities and said, this is a good idea, this is a bad. We walked through it. And I finally came to the realization that, okay, this will be fun. I'm really bad at this, so it'll only last like 2 or 3 weeks, and I can check the box and move on. And so I said yes, and I walked through this in the book, John. If you mentioned the chapter, but like I knew that there would be some headwinds. I knew that the left would blow their minds. I knew the media would go nuts. I just didn't realize how quick, how soon, and how visceral. And then it was just interesting to see. It was like everything got consumed by the other cast members would get asked in the press line, well, what do you think about Sean? And is he working as hard? And, does he talk politics? And it was an introduction to me in a world that I'd never been in, because it was sort of like this mashup of the different cast members and where they're from. Ray Lewis played for the Ravens, Lamar Odom played basketball. I mean, there was sort of a sports thing, a music thing with some of the cast members, and a movie thing. But then you were physically in Hollywood and dealing with the headwinds. And I found that most people, not just around the show, but even that I bumped into in Hollywood and LA, were nice, kind people. It was almost like people had to go ring a bell at one point and be like, hey, just remember, he's a Republican. He worked for Trump. And they'd be like, oh yeah, I don't like you anymore. And it was challenging because I never made anything political. I didn't want it to be. In fact, I mentioned that the whole show, the beauty of it was this respite from politics. It was this idea that you could have a fun, civil, good conversation with people, kind of like we used to do, and not feel like everything was political. And so anyway, I enjoyed it. They tell you at the beginning of the show that it's a family. And it's sort of like one of those catchphrases that they throw your way. And they're like, oh, you're going to love it. It's going to be a family. And I thought, okay, yeah, I get it. And honest to God, I count it as one of the best experiences of my life. I met some amazing people that I still stay in touch with to the day. I'm going to be visiting with some of them in the next couple of weeks as I travel around in some places. And we reached out and said, oh, I heard you're coming to my town. And it's not just the cast members and the pros. It's the people who, do security, who, do the publicity, who do the food services at the, on the stage area. It really was. And I'm glad I did it. I had a blast. I learned a bunch of stuff. And I honestly, if they called me today and said, hey, we're doing another season and they were picking people with S's, I would come back in a heartbeat.
Oh, yeah, it's funny you'd say that. That was actually my next question, Sean, is, hey, listen, if given the opportunity, would you do it again? And it sounds like you would.
It's good, wholesome fun. And I talk about this in the book, but of all the reality shows, there is no prize if you win Dancing with the Stars. I mean, you get a mirror ball, and it literally, I think, I joke in the book, I said, unless you're like a Dancing with the Stars aficionado, there's no value. You can't go to Tiffany's or sell it at Sotheby's, or, maybe you can put it on eBay, but there's no like huge cash. It's not $1 million. And you don't get a recording contract or become a professional dancer. So you're there to have fun. And the cool part is everybody there cheers for each other. Like, you're up against yourself. You get the scores you get from the judges, you get people to vote for you. So it's almost like one of those things where you get to be cheering on everyone else. They're cheering you on. You're not trying to knock someone out. It's not like Survivor where you're trying to get rid of them.
Yeah. Well, the closest thing I can even think of in my life where I took a flyer like that, I became a judge for the Miss America pageant, and I caught the same kind of flack that you're talking about. How can you do something like that? But at the end of the day, good on you, Sean. Taking risks and having fun. That's what life's supposed to be all about, right? So.
But and it's funny because I agree with you. There's things when you look back, like I've done so many television appearances and done things that frankly I don't want my kids to watch. And it's nice to be able to say, like, my kids we now gather. I hadn't watched Dance with the Stars before I did the show. And so even now, as they head into season 29 on Monday nights, I can sit down with my kids and they can vote for someone and talk about what, who's that person and wow, they did a good job. We need more of that, not less of it. And so it was fun on a lot of levels, and it was really an enjoyable experience for not just me, but my family. In the book, I talk about the fact that I'm on the board of 2 veterans organizations. I got to bring wounded service members and their families to the shows. And you forget, you're out there, everybody goes to the Reagan Library. But for a lot of folks, being told, hey, you can get this Hollywood night out where you get to come and meet all the stars and you get treated like a VIP. For those people who sacrificed for our country, to say, hey, you and your spouse or your caregiver, tonight's on me, is a really cool thing to be able to do. And so it was fun to make the experience broader than myself.
Yeah, that's neat. And it made for a great start to the book. So way to go, Sean, really. The only thing I have to say, I was surprised, I didn't know this till I read your book, was the one guy who seems like a really nice guy who leads the show, Tom Bergeron. He's the one guy that takes shots at you from the start. It just seemed odd.
And if you had picked out like 30 faces at the beginning of the show and said, tell me the one guy that's going to pop off, I'm with you. I loved watching this guy on TV. He's always funny and jovial. And here's the thing, despite the fact that he popped off about me, I still think he's a good host. Like, this is, I think, what makes the difference between conservatives and liberals these days is that, like, he may not like me. Obviously, I don't like his politics, but I think he's good at what he does. And so it's weird. And I said it at the outset, he's been a really good host of the show. He's entertaining. And I also just thought, why of all the people that have been on the show who have done some rather nefarious / criminal things, you're coming after me?
Yeah, well put.
No names mentioned.
Yeah, well put. And then around that time, afterwards, you hit the talk show circuit. You did Fallon, you did Steve Colbert, the thing with the Emmys and all that. And it seems like it would have been a lot of fun, but at the same time, that's where you talk about how, in the modern day, it just seems like comedy has taken a turn where it's all seems to be personal and biting now. It's not really comedy anymore, is it?
No, and this goes back to what I was saying about Tom. I mean, look, I get back in the day, Leno and Letterman were both left-leaning, but they were equal opportunity offenders, and it was funny. They poked fun at people. They weren't mean about them. And I think the difference in the turn that we've taken is that whether it's Colbert or Fallon or Jimmy or Kimmel or Seth Meyers even, it's like we've got to be mean and we've got to be political. John, you've got a long history in Republican politics. I mean, I was watching the other night a clip because I didn't watch the show, and it was Jamie Harrison is the Democratic challenger to Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. And I'm trying to remember, I think he was on Kimmel. But the point is, I was like, I mean, in my entire political career, I've never heard of a challenger campaign going on a late night show that wasn't running for president, right? It was, and that's where it is now, where it's like, we've tried to figure out how to turn these late night shows into Sunday political shows where they can all, instead of tell jokes, find ways to poke fun at conservatives or the president. And it used to be the place where at the end of the day, you could tune in, kind of laugh, relax, and then fall asleep. I don't think that they're funny anymore, and that's a shame.
Yeah, it is. And then, you riff from that to a vivid example. It's not just specifically comedy, but it's about how the media has decided to treat liberals versus conservatives. And you use the famous Blackface example that whether you're a liberal or conservative, a number of people have been involved in that. Yet, depending on which side of the fence you're on, you're treated differently, right? Give us an example of that.
Well, look at Megyn Kelly. She's on her show, asks a question about the appropriateness of blackface. And the funny thing is, I don't want to relitigate it, but I think that what I think Megyn was getting at, I've never asked her, is a deeper understanding of why certain things offend people of color, which I frankly think as a white person is helpful, because we need to understand more why certain things that we might not be steeped in knowledge of offend certain people because of past racial injustices, et cetera. I think that broadens our understanding and our empathy and our concern, because we go, wow, I've never understood that. I've never had to do it. I can now understand in a more personal way why that troubles you or hurts you. And therefore, I don't want to do it again. And so it makes us better people. We don't use words. We don't do actions that might offend somebody just because we weren't brought up in a way or exposed to an environment in which we're allowed to see certain things that again, just depending on our socioeconomic status or where we grew up. But she got knocked off her show for asking a question. She apologized for it, et cetera. But then you go down the long list that I lay out in the book of all of these folks on the left who used blackface, whether it's elected officials on the left in Democratic politics, or people like Joy Behar or Jimmy Kimmel, all these other folks, and yet there's not a peep, because if you're on the left, it's excused and washed away as long as you are advancing a greater good in the leftist culture. it's okay and forgiven. And again, you go through this with comedy. I talk about some of the folks on Saturday Night Live where one comic was punished and not allowed back on because of a joke that had been unearthed. And yet some of these other folks, when they find homophobic or anti-Semitic things that they said, as long as they say, oh, that wasn't who I am anymore and I didn't mean it. Joy Reid from MSNBC, for example, I mean, she made up a whole host of stories about the FBI investigating hacks of her thing, and yet she gets rewarded with a primetime show. So there's this amazing double standard that exists when the left does something and the right does something, and it's this, you know, more pervasive cancel culture where we sort of figure out who gets canceled out, because it's not the subject. Certain people can say something, other people can't. And if you're in the pursuit of the leftist ideology, I mean, Joy Behar the other day had this unbelievably, and I use the word attractive, not in a physical appearance, but just as a candidate. There's a woman named Kim Klacik. She's an unbelievably attractive candidate in the sense that she's articulate. She's got a great plan. She knows how to message well. She's been raising money. I mean, she's the kind of person that you really want to raise. She's running in Baltimore. She's got these ads on that are just amazing. She goes on The View. She goes on The View, and Joy Behar tells her, a black woman, that she, quote, had permission to dress in blackface from the black community. Somehow, I didn't realize that you could do that. Where do you go to ask for it? And that Kim, as a black woman, didn't have the support of the black community. And I'm thinking to myself, in what world does an older white woman preach to a black woman and tell her that she doesn't have the support of the black community, but she, the white woman, does? I guess on The View, it's okay.
That's right. Yeah, no problem with that. The book is great because you play at a high level, you get down in the weeds on a lot of these issues, and up at the higher altitudes, Sean, you go after corporate activism, big tech, Hollywood. I mean, these big segments.
The funny thing is, John, I would say this. I think what I try to do isn't necessarily go after. Maybe you're right in some cases. There's a little go after. But it's also exposing, because I don't think, when I was researching different subjects and I would go down like a rabbit hole and be like, oh my, wait a second, that can't be true. And it was like you start to realize what's really going on and what motivates some of these people. And it explains a lot, is the way I would put it, because I was like, why would a company do this? Why would a Hollywood firm not want to do this? And you start to look at it and you go, okay, it finally makes sense now.
Yeah. Okay, so in the exposing of big institutions like that, is there one, Sean, that you think is, I don't know, it's like the most pernicious? It's one that is undercutting our society more than any other? You know, is it the fact that big tech goes after censorship? Is it that corporate America is just bowing to political correctness? I mean, or are they all, you know, a pox on all their houses as you expose it all?
I think it's a little of, you know, pox on all their houses. But what worries me the most is the chapter on education, where you realize what's happening in public schools these days in terms of what they're teaching them in terms of math and science and all of these things, but rather this idea of what to protest, what causes to care for. And there's a part in the book where I talk about the fact that many schools, including Fairfax County, which is close to where I live in Virginia, allows kids days off to go protest climate change. Now, a lot of people will look at this, and I say it very specifically in the book. I'm not here to take issue with the issue. What I am here to say is, if you're reading the book and you say, well, okay, I think that climate change is a bad issue, I would ask you two questions. One, is this an appropriate use of class time? At a time when we're falling behind in areas like STEM, math, science, should we be saying, let's take a day off and go protest something? Some people may say it's worth the day off because you learn something. I think the way that we're falling behind, especially behind China, it's not. The second thing I would argue is take out climate change for a second and assume that Republicans take over your school board and that becomes a pro-life march. Are you still comfortable with public school teachers sending your kids out to support a conservative cause? And I don't think that many liberals would answer the question the same way anymore. And so the thing that I think is fascinating to me is to realize what's happening when so many parents who are working so hard these days put their kids on that bus in the morning. They assume that the teacher is just teaching him, giving him or her the tools to succeed in the future, when in fact they're coming home and saying, Mommy, I don't like Donald Trump because he's a bad man, or I understand that, this issue is really important. And you're thinking to yourself, why is it your job, not mine as a parent, to teach them values and things like that? I'll leave the teaching of the studies and the subjects up to you. You leave the values and the principles up to me as a parent.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't agree with you more. So let me ask you, knowing what you know about the university experience in America, would you ever second guess whether to send your kids to college? I mean, it's still a ticket to, to success in society, but it concerns a lot of parents now and it didn't used to.
That's a really good question, because especially in the age of COVID, where you're sitting around saying, I'm stroking a $70,000 check to go to a private institution for a kid to sit at home and go on Zooms. When I could sit around and take classes online or, study. And so I hope that there's a fundamental transformation in how college is looked at. I don't know that it will happen in part because of how it's financed, but I think it should be. And I think that the question you're asking is so important, because there's things that kids can learn today that they don't necessarily need to go to a 4-year liberal arts school. I mean, I can tell you in retrospect, obviously, in some ways I wouldn't be where I am today had I not gone to the small liberal arts college that I did. But did it prepare me for the future? I don't think so. The experience did, living with folks and getting to know folks, sure. But the classes that I took, no, it was not. And I think that I mentioned in the book, I've had the opportunity through a lot of foundation grants to go onto college campuses and be a college speaker. And it's amazing how many times I asked them to raise their hand. How many college conservative speakers have you had on your campus? 1, 5, 2. It's never been more than 5, and it's usually 1 or 2. And I think to myself that this is an opportunity for these kids to learn, hear from different things. And every time I've gone somewhere, granted it's met by protest and usually some kind of, outrageous statements, but there's always a packed crowd of kids that have answers, because that's what they should be. And it's almost like the staff and the faculty are complicit in trying to push out these voices and this opportunity to learn and to hear from somebody that's not. And the funny part is, I don't know about you, but I go to, I'll tune into folks on the left giving speeches. I want to know what they're saying and why they're thinking what they're. It fascinates me, and I think it makes me stronger as a conservative to understand why and how they construct an argument. So it's almost like, and I don't think I'm alone in that I think a lot of conservatives like to do that, but it's almost like the left feels as though it's a threat to them to hear any voice that might give, opposition to their thoughts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, on the way into the Reagan Library this morning to interview you, Sean, I was turned on NPR, and I do that specifically for that reason. I want to understand what the other side's thinking and saying, and how does it line up against my own arguments. So I couldn't agree more. You recount in the book, Sean, you look at the sectors of society, the media, Hollywood and entertainment, academia, big tech, and now we're heading into sports. All of these things that have become, political theater, where it seems that the left is really winning the day. I mean, now you can't go to an NFL football game without having to kneel to prove you're patriotic. I mean, and it seems to me, tell me what you think about this, the only sector left where conservative ideology has a fighting chance is in politics, and it's not even fair there either. I mean, is there any part of society yet that the liberal imagination doesn't own?
Well, I think the one that I think is next on the list is religion. And I think that you're going to see a lot of the left start to co-opt religion and start to say that you can be religious, if you will, and have all of these left-wing policies and views. And they don't, so they're going to co-opt religion so that you can't get up and run for office or try to espouse your views and talk about it in the context of Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Muslim. I mean, that without it sort of having this muted sense of, well, you can be a good Catholic and still be, pro-choice, and you can be a good Jew and still allow for, the following social. I mean, they're going to start to dilute the meaning and the strength of some of these religions. So I think that's what's going next. But I do think you're right that the one place that conservatives still have the ability to go out and fight and win is in elected politics, because at the end of the day, the idea, if the idea is popular and you get enough people to win and you get 50+1, boom, you're in office. But you also see, and I talk about this in the book, the way they're covered. The left gets a much different pass than the right does when they're running for office. And you see that now with Joe Biden, where he's talking or not about his position on court packing, which would be a pretty substantial issue for the American people to know. And he shames reporters into asking them, saying, of course, I'm not going to tell you, because you know what? It would give you a headline. God forbid a headline. That's kind of normally, I've been doing this a long time. That's what you normally want. You want to say things that get headlines for your campaign.
Yeah, and then those very same reporters don't dare to follow up and say, yeah, but I really want to know.
But they actually feel like, when I was watching this interaction the other day, I felt like they were ashamed, and they're like, I'm sorry, Mr. Biden, I didn't mean to ask the question. I'll go back to my Trump questions. And when you have a press corps that's complicit, that's a problem. And I think the nice thing for me is when you see the opportunities that exist more on the right, whether it's news platforms like my show on Newsmax or the Daily Caller or Breitbart, all of these opportunities that are on the right, but also opportunities like this, where now the Reagan Library can say, yes, we're closed because of COVID, but we can continue to have conversations and get the word out, and we can put YouTube videos up, and we can do Facebook Lives and Zooms, and the conversation can continue in a way that it couldn't have, say, 5-10 years ago. That's crucial to conservative movement.
Yeah. Well, and going back to your other point, Sean, about the next sector is religion. As we speak, these hearings presently going on with Coney Barrett are what are we zooming in on? Like yesterday was her faith, and whether or not as a Christian she could be a good judge.
The thing is, I was thinking this last night. I think that the Senate Democrats, and I'm not in the business of giving them advice, we're making a strategic mistake, because every time I watch Amy Coney Barrett give an answer, I'm just blown away by her depth and breadth and knowledge of the court, of constitutional law, of precedent. And I think to myself, I've seen more messages with people saying, that's who I want my daughter to look up to. That's the kind of woman that I want to be a role model for friends of mine, or my daughter, or my friend. And I think that it's strategically a mistake the longer the Democrats drive this out, because she is such a great example of what a good conservative constitutional judge looks like. And I keep saying, keep the hearings going. Let's do it, because it reflects well on us. And I think that the Democrats are talking about everything but her and her qualifications. And it really makes them look like that, for all of their virtue signaling, that you have a very immensely qualified woman for the court, and yet they're coming up with like, well, we understood that you replaced stevia with sugar in a recipe. Does that make you fit? One of your kids' homework was they are pulling out the kitchen sink between her faith and all of these other extraneous things that have nothing to do with her ability to be a fantastic justice. And it just shows you how desperate they are.
Yeah. And as we found out a day or two ago, all with no notes, right?
When Senator Cornyn did that, I was thinking, I hope to God that you know what you're doing, and I assume that he's a brilliant tactician. And I thought, okay. And when she held it up, it wasn't just that she held it up; the face she made. It was like I was so proud of her, and I don't even know her. I was like, oh.
Yeah. Okay, so you talk at a fair length in the book about the media's treatment of President Trump, and some well said stuff. And I don't tell me. I'll just be interested to hear how you answer this question. But while the media, in your mind and my mind, a lot of people's mind, has been remarkably unfair to President Trump. Really unfair. He's brought some of this on himself, right? His style and his approach, right? So talk about that for a minute.
Well, I'll give you an example. I talked to him the other day, and I said, the line that he used in the debate, 47 months versus 47 years in action, dig into that. I'm like, you have a ton of accomplishments. You've made a lot of progress. Look, the president has been treated unfairly. There's no question in my mind. But people don't vote on you or for you because you were treated unfairly. They vote for you because you accomplish things and that you have a vision of how to move the country and people's lives forward. And so if you want to settle grievances, there's plenty of time for that after office or in a second term. But until you get to it, it's not worth it. And I think there are days in which he could either be clearer on his statement or, understand they're out to get you. So don't let them take the bait. Don't hang it out there. Be clear. And I think, again, he's got a record that he can fall back on, and he should do that more and more and more. But there are times when I think, I used to joke that if we were having a good 72 hours in the White House, that's when I started to really get nervous and cross my fingers, because it was like there could never be a moment which, that errant tweet would go off and you'd be like, okay, there we go. And he can just take himself off the message of having a really good time.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it had to be frustrating for you in that you admired him and you supported him. But of all the jobs where the president would need good counsel on do this, try this, do that, it comes from his communications people and how he speaks, right? And he can be his own best friend and his own worst enemy in that regard, right? I mean, it's your profession to advise him, and if he's not going to take the advice, he's not going to take the advice, right?
The hard part, though, is that he's been doing this for himself for so long that it's hard at that time, 71 years old, to come in and say, oh, hi, tell me how to operate, because I did this the whole way. And oh, by the way, you guys were part of that establishment media, RNC faction that, told me that this would never work. I did it my way. I won. And now you want to come in and tell me how I should operate as president, and so it's not as easy to go in and tell somebody who, frankly, in many cases, I had given him advice during the campaign, and he, in a lot of cases, chose not to listen to it, did what he would do and kind of look over at you and be like, see, I did it my way. It worked.
Yeah.
And he does. He flips it. I spent 25 years writing communications plans, giving advice up to principals, either elected officials, military officers, what have you, and say, okay, they would tinker with it and say, I would rather say it this way or whatever. And then, okay, let's execute it. Trump flips that on its head and says, here's what I want to say, how I want to say it, go get it out there. And it's a different dynamic.
Yeah, well, the penultimate example of that, Sean, what you're saying has to be that moment in the campaign. You were not yet White House press secretary. This was campaign and the Hollywood access thing. I mean, 99 out of 100 people that I know in the world of politics that have been experts in prose their whole lives would have said, that's it, it's over, hang up your cleats, it's done. And Trump just barreled right through it, right? I mean, amazing.
That was the second debate in St. Louis, which theoretically we should be having this week. And not only did he, think about this. He, instead of, everyone's saying he should be contrite, he should ask for forgiveness, which he kind of did. And then he turns around, flies to St. Louis with Juanita Broderick and the other Clinton accusers, sits him in the front row and says, let's roll. And I'm thinking to myself, who does this?
Yeah, I know, amazing.
That's the kind of thing that you would have just never, honest to God, if you had come to me and handed me a note and said, here's what you should do, you'll win with this, I would have been like, get John Hivers some help right now. Because and there's a reason when they executed that they didn't tell anyone on staff. They were like, no one's going to think this is a good idea. And they were right.
Yeah, amazing, really amazing. So riffing off of that, the elections are about 3 weeks from now. Turn on the nightly news, all you're going to hear is the polls are bad for Trump, things are terrible, he's going to lose, all this stuff. And yet I'm remembering that's exactly what you and the campaign went through 4 years ago. I mean, do you see parallels to that? And could it possibly turn out any different this time?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of parallels, especially in the states and the numbers we're seeing. And there's a lot of flaws in the polls. But that being said, do I think that we're ahead in a lot of places? No. I think it is extremely close. I think in a lot of places he is behind. But it's where we were last time, which is we were behind, but there was a delta that we could make up if we went and executed the ground game successfully. I think that's still there. There's some variables that are different, though. Hillary Clinton was a despised candidate by many in her own party. Joe Biden may have some crazy, wacky policies, and I don't think that he's the same Joe Biden he was from 10 years ago, but he's not hated. Joe Biden's a nice guy. He's likable. And there's not that visceral reaction that there was with Hillary Clinton. So when you have a state like Michigan that was won by 10,704 votes, or 0.22%, and you take out a bad candidate like Hillary Clinton and put in a milquetoast candidate like Joe Biden, it makes that suddenly go, okay, well, that puts Michigan in a very different place now. Pennsylvania was 44,000 votes. Wisconsin was 24,000 votes. So suddenly these states become much more in play. Arizona, there's no question about it. We're in that's in jeopardy right now. That's a state that we shouldn't have had to think about. That being said, I think the Trump campaign would argue that both Nevada and Minnesota are in play, but we're not in a place right now where we're at 270 and trying to gain more. I think, there is a much better scenario for Biden getting there than us, meaning that there are more states that are in play that could put him over the top. That being said, I think the secret weapon has always been that for the last 4 years, the Trump campaign and the RNC have worked on a ground game and a data operation that have allowed them to focus on the general election for 4 years, as opposed to the last 6 months in the case of Biden. That, in my mind, is worth a field goal. But like all other things, the field goal is worth 3, and you have to get the race within 3.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so back to the book for a second. You make the point a few times, I think. Listen, Trump's, because of modern day social media, the internet, tweets, the rest of that, it's kind of like Donald Trump and his massive social media machine and his ability to have direct contact with the voters. And then there's the media that's all opposed to him, almost all opposed to him, and not on his side. And in some respects, I look at this upcoming election and see, well, I wonder what's going to win. Is it Trump's social media arsenal and his ability to reach voters directly? Or does the majority of the media being against you for so long, is that going to have this eroding effect? And there's no way your social media can get around it, right? That's kind of the battle here, right?
It is. And if you look at a state like Florida, Trump won by over 9 points now, last time, seniors. He's now down to +5. And that kind of erosion in a voting group that's that disproportionately large can be effective. And I think the other issue, and you heard him joke about this at his rally in Pennsylvania, where he talked about, come on, suburban women, what do you need to do to like me? Like, I really want, he knows there's been erosion in those groups. And when you're playing on a razor's edge and you've had erosion, whether it's because the media's pounded you every night or whatever the reason is, that's not a good place going into the final stretch of an election. So he's got to figure out how to make up that delta in those two key groups. That being said, I will tell you, and the funny thing is, the place where I would have never guessed, or I probably wouldn't have predicted Trump would be where he is now, the margins that he has gained in both the Hispanic community and the Black community have been amazing. The problem is, as much of a big deal as the media like to make them out, they're disproportionately smaller blocks of the electorate. So as much as you can do well in them, a smaller drop in seniors is not as good as a bigger gain in either the Black or Hispanic voting bloc because of their disproportionate size as a total proportion of the electorate.
Yeah, well, so let's presume he makes up the ground. This becomes a very tight election. Do you foresee, given what the things have been said on both sides, Sean, that we could end up with one heck of a Bush v. Gore 2,000 times 100, right? Are we possibly heading there?
I think so. When you think about a state like Pennsylvania, who has changed the rules and allowed ballots to be cast, mail-in ballots to be cast without signatures, without postmarks, up to I think it's 7 days after the election, you say, there's no question. My view is that Democrats are probably going to lose on election night and then make it up through mail-in ballots. And what they're going to argue is that any ballot should count, try to make a very simple argument that people would say, well, of course any ballot should count. They won't tell you that those are ballots that came in after the deadline, that didn't have a signature, that didn't, in Pennsylvania, they call them naked ballots, that didn't have the second envelope stuffed inside the first envelope. And they'll claim like, well, the voter intent was to vote for Joe Biden. So I think that you're going to see multiple Bush v. Gores. And remember, even in Bush v. Gore, the big issue was obviously Florida, but in New Mexico, the Bush campaign was within, I think it was 1,000 votes, and chose not to contest that because it wouldn't have really been that detrimental. I think in this election, we have the potential to see multiple states contested within the days following the November 3rd in-person election voting. And so it'll be interesting to see how many are happening and then whether that would ultimately go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, got it. I'm going to spin back to your role as press secretary for a minute. I know we just have a few more minutes, but I don't get to ask you these questions often, so I'm going to throw it out there. Everyone knows that the role of press secretary to any president is, if not the toughest job in Washington, D.C. I mean, you're on a stage like no other. And you went out there, took your knocks, faced the press like you always did, day to day. It was a traditional approach to facing the White House press corps. Since then, there's been these different feints. We're going to have a briefing today, we're not. We're not going to have it for a few weeks, we do. Do you think it's a tool that, good or bad, the press secretary and the president should allow that to occur every day to get the message out? Or do you think, listen, it's become kind of a joke, it's just a pitched battle that it's a lot of theater, but it's not serving its initial purpose. I wonder where have you come to settle on that in your mind?
Yeah, I think that the American people have a right to see their government in action almost every day, right? In some way, shape, or form. This president in particular goes out and engages with the media almost daily. And so I think that suffices. The question is, does the press have an opportunity to question our leadership in government? They should. And so I don't think an on-camera briefing every day suits that, though. So there should be some mechanism by which the press is given access. They can ask questions every day. That's a fallacy that they perpetuate. The door is always open. They can walk right up to the press secretary's door and to all the other press officers. There's literally an open bullpen for the most part, with the exception of the press secretary's actual office that they can queue up outside of. But they don't need to have an on-camera briefing every day. It's good to see it once in a while, maybe once or twice a week, especially with the president engaging the way he does. But there does not need to be what has become a show. And I think that there can be a combination of on-camera, off-camera. But it has become an opportunity for a lot of these folks to become YouTube stars that want to sensationalize it. I think there's additional reforms that can happen. For one, I think the camera doesn't need to go on the reporter. It should stay on the press secretary, as it does in some of the other institutions, whether it's the Pentagon or the State Department, because it shouldn't be about the reporter. It should be about holding government officials accountable, not allowing them to have their clip and their click. So there's things like that that can be done to make it less excitable, chaotic, and more informative.
How about, Sean, is there a reporter or a media outlet that you would single out to say, listen, there might be as liberal as the day is long and they're tough as heck on you or on the White House, but you got to give them their due, Is there an individual, somebody would say, here's a good example of somebody that might come at you real hard, but they're absolutely fair?
I always like to single out Jonathan Swan at Axios, but there's a handful of them. I mean, Jen Jacobs at Bloomberg's really good. Steve Holland at Reuters. But I think the thing about Jonathan in particular, and Jen as well, is they're tenacious is probably the best word. They go after stories, but they're fair, and they'll say to you, okay, John, I've got this story. This is what it says. Do you dispute any part of it? If so, tell me why. And I'm not saying I'm going to change it. I want you to give you your due. But they're well sourced. They know what they're talking about, and they can be trusted. And I don't agree with everything they write or how they write, but I don't often doubt when I see a byline of theirs that there's anything wrong with the story. I'll say, there might be some dispute among the quote or something like that, but they're in the bullseye area.
Yeah, well, that's a sign of a real pro, right? I mean, that's the way it used to be.
It is. And you say, I disagree with you, but you were fair about the story. I didn't like the angle, but these days it's few and far between that I can say that about.
Yeah. Now, you're the first White House press secretary in the history of the United States, I think, to leave the post and then come back in the role of covering the White House and the press secretary's briefing. You're the very first, right? And I just wonder, how did that feel, Sean?
I was the press secretary. I did Dancing with the Stars, and then walking into the press briefing room, I got a show on every night at 6:00 on Newsmax. And we have a seat, Newsmax. There's two White House correspondents. I thought it would be really interesting for the show to be able to go in, ask the president some questions. That ranked up there in the nervousness because the president of the United States is now calling on me. Number one. Number two, when you're on television, not that I haven't done that before, but it was sort of like in a different light. And you've got all the eyes of the press corps saying, what are you going to ask? And I had folks from NBC saying it was inappropriate that I was there. And the funny thing is, I write about this in the book, that the questions that I asked the president, one was about the Stock Act. There was a member of Congress that was trading stocks and profiting off them, actually several at the time. And then I asked him another question about his response. I think it was early in COVID, and other outlets wrote off of the questions that I had asked. I was the 15th, 16th person that was called on in the briefing, and yet people were so outraged. And I thought to myself, wait a second, I asked the questions that you didn't ask, and now you're getting mad at me.
You're on the speaking circuit, and I wonder, what have you chosen, Sean, to have your message be all about? What's the theme of when you talk to any number of different groups?
Well, it depends. It depends on who the group is, and because sometimes it's an organization that really wants a specific message. I do a lot of speeches on college campuses, and a lot of times that message is about getting involved, is about understanding the landscape that we live in today, and a lot of what the themes of the book are. And then there's obviously a lot of political organizations that I speak to as well, and they, especially election season, right? And there's a lot of groups that want to know what the lay of the land is, what it was like in 2016, what worked, what didn't, what tools of the trade do we see, how to communicate effective messages. And I think that's part of it, is trying to give people an understanding of how to create successful, comprehensive communication strategies, because I think a lot of people get wrapped around these days in tactics. They're like, okay, well, I sent a tweet, I posted this. Those are all a myriad of tactics. How do you combine those tactics to create a comprehensive strategy that drives home not just a message, but a message that people act on and behave differently, because whether they vote, they volunteer, they donate. And so trying to get people to understand that, because too often, again, it's like you get people who get caught up and said, well, I put up 15 tweets. And it's like, that's great. What were you trying to achieve?
Yeah, got it. I lied. Here's the very last question. I know you're involved in a number of nonprofits, Sean. You do some great work in that area. Is there one that you'd like to give a shout out to, someone, one that we should, you should talk about briefly today because of their importance?
Yeah, I mean, both the Independence Fund and the Yellow Ribbon Fund are two veterans organizations. The Independence Fund provides tracked wheelchairs to veterans with mobility issues, and these things look like little tanks. And they give a veteran the ability to sometimes, and one guy said it this way, he said, I always love to go for a walk. And what he meant was someone, instead of having to have someone push him in a wheelchair, you get in this thing and go in his backyard. And it was just so cool. They allow him to go hunting, and because they can get over all sorts of terrain. And the other one is Yellow Ribbon Fund, and that takes care of caregivers. So if you have a family that's going to Walter Reed, the service member is usually taken care of, but it's the wife or the caregiver or the son or the daughter that they have to pay for. And if you're an E5 to an E6, whatever, you're getting $30,000 or $40,000 a year, and just flying to Walter Reed and staying in a hotel is going to cost you $1,000. So they take care of that. And those are two great organizations.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sean. Well, we hope everybody listening, watching today will give them a hand. So, Sean, just a wonderful book. Congratulations. I'm sure you're happy with it. You take care of yourself.
And I'm looking forward to being there in person again soon.
You got it. Take care,
thanks,
Sean.
Sean.
Bye.
We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number one about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.